Okay, just checking that you can see my screen, Richard.
Yes, everything looks
okay.
A little bit hazy. A little bit hazy.
Okay. How about that now?
We can work with that, I think.
Okay. All right. So, thank you, everyone, for. Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, Mark could not be with us today because of the various things that are happening in relation in the States at the moment. But what we're going to look at today is the work that Mark has been doing with his colleague Gil Einstein at Furman University. Now, Gil has been working with Mark on what they're called the knowledge, beliefs, commitment, and planning framework. So what we're looking at here is, I guess, leading on from Tom's work, is all about the translation of going from what we know in the science to the actual, the students' metacognitive awareness of what strategies work, how to apply them, when to apply them, and then more importantly, have belief that it works for them. And what was interesting, there were a few questions in the chat from the previous session that I think we will sort of get on and answer today. So where do we start? So I guess, and this sort of links to what Tom was saying earlier on. So when we look at students' use of the study strategies, what's really interesting is that the dominant, when we look at the field, now the field is often largely controlled in relation to the studies based on the tertiary of the university context. So you have the Washington University, the CARPIC study, which is the sort of like the litmus test of student study strategies. And what you can see there is 84% of university students reread notes or their textbook, and they identify, so 55%. So the majority of students will identify their number one study strategy or study activity as rereading. And what was interesting, Pooja Agarwal also identified as very similar sort of dominance of rereading in a study of high school and middle school students, where they really focus on sort of that repetition learning. And I guess as teachers, we see this repetition, come in essence when we look at cramming and so forth. And what's interesting is that there's been, and as Tom sort of alluded to, there's been tremendous amounts of work done on identifying the strategies that have the greatest value. And if you're wanting to look at these strategies, and Vicky and I will be referring to them in our keynote a little bit later, the Dunlosky 2013 big systematic review with some of the eminent researchers in the field, and Pashler's work as well. And they went through and they looked at all sorts of different study strategies and the utility. And often in the science, we hear the term utility. So utility is basically the value that the student gets in terms of a learning gain for the time invested. So utility is more than just what you learn, it's the amount of time that we have to invest in that strategy. And what's really interesting, and this comes from the tertiary context that Mark works within, is, and we see this in the Australian context, where there are vast amounts of support provided to university students who experience academic difficulty. So at UQ, they have the Institute for Teaching and Learning and Innovation, which is a large body that offers support, whether it be workshops, coaching, online materials. We see lots of this pushed through tertiary libraries in relation to strategy development. And what's interesting is that there's all this support that's provided at the university context, but at the same time, what's really interesting, and we go back to some of Hattie's original work, is that often we find, and it comes back time and time again, is that the older the student becomes, the more resistant they are to change. And we need to understand, and we've experienced that in our own context here, when we've tried to embed and sort of focus on developing student knowledge about strategies, But what's really interesting is that if I'm a student and I'm coming to the end of my secondary schooling, or I'm a university student and I've had all of this success in my educational career, and now you tell me that you want me to change, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, no wonder the students are resistant to change, because if we put ourselves into that particular student's position and sort of transition, we're actually challenging the things that have worked for them. And what we do see is that often students are able to survive with fairly ineffective or low utility strategies for a significant period of time of their educational career, but it all comes unstuck at some point. And so what we see here in relation to Mark's work is the idea that when we look at it, there's lots of stuff given in relation to examples where students are given a particular lecture in the US context. All students, it appears from our reading, do a sort of learning strategy, study skills. It's fairly common sort of compulsory or core subject. And so students are instructed in relation to, or given lectures or one-offs in relation to what's a good study strategy or learning strategy, and vice versa. Sometimes we've seen, entire schools, and when we talk about schools, we're talking about universities, where there might be the National Science Foundation are doing massive works in engineering at the moment, where they're basically trying to upskill students in particular study strategies that suit the engineering field. And then there's the final point that Mark has here is in relation to us. So at Churchy, we've been working in this space for a long time. And the challenge for us is that there's a big missing element that we're finding in relation to the ability for students to self-regulate their strategy. And I guess what it comes back to is this flawed assumption that imparting knowledge about a specific learning strategy is sufficient. And I would highly recommend anyone, if you can, read the seminal work of the Bjorks, the husband and wife team from California. They talk about the illusion of confidence and metacognition, and they're a great place to start. And I guess what the Bjorks are talking about here with Yang is the idea that just knowing about something is insufficient. But often what we find is, and in relation to conversations with Mark and Gil, is that most of the work in this field is actually focused on actually just imparting knowledge. And what we're going to talk to you about now is basically Gil and Mark's training framework for the knowledge, beliefs, commitment, and planning. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get into some of their concrete illustrations of how they've done it within their own university course, and then some preliminary results. And so we start with, in terms of knowledge, beliefs, commitment, and planning. This is there's no, as Mark says in his notes, he basically says there is no controversy here or debate. Everyone needs to know knowledge about specific learning strategies. But what Mark does highlight in his notes and in his book, Make It Stick, which is a great book, is the idea that this is where most programs stop. They start here and they stop here. And then we call it knowledge about and knowledge how, and maybe knowledge where. But in many cases, very few programs actually get beyond that. Now, belief. Now, this is the challenge that a lot of people are facing, is the fact is that we want, there's this challenge, there's this notion that students hold that they are unique, that there's this eagerness to believe in Yan and the Bjorks 2016 really important study, is that there's this notion that students believe, oh, this strategy works well for me and I'm unique. So just because it works for you doesn't mean it works for me. And what we've found is that often, and this sort of goes back to what Tom was saying, is that it's all about the uptake and the translation. Even though we show that students, and we highlight that retrieval practice is probably one of the highest utility and best study strategies that exist, but there's this notion that it won't work for them. And what's really important here is that we do look at most of the stuff in the field has worked in the lab, in the controls of the lab. But then when we start to put it into the nuance of the classroom environment, we've got to take into account the teacher and their practice and their pedagogy, the content, the subject, the assignment. Then we actually then need to look at the students in the class. And then at the end of the day, what we end up with is a fairly diverse and challenging situation. So then what we need to understand when we look at belief is this idea of how can belief be fostered. And what's interesting is that we need to provide, and this is what and you'll see in some of Mark's experimental work later, is that you actually have to create these sometimes contrived or these sort of, suitably adapted in sort of learning contexts where you have to somehow and repeatedly show that whatever study strategy that you're showing clearly works. And even when we look at like the Bjork's work, is that again, is even when students are saying, here, let's learn this material through massing or blocking, here, learn this material through interleaving, then we need to somehow show that it works for them, okay? And what we need to do with that though, is that the only way that we can really show that is with some sort of test or with an exam, because there needs to be an evaluation from the student's perspective. So basically, the student has to experience the benefits of the strategy. The issue is that to do that, we actually sometimes need to control the environment, which means that we have to control the environment where we have to use identical material, because we've used, and in our own context, we did this particular thing with humanities and Cornell notes. And we trained the students up in using Cornell notes as a reference and note-taking system when they were reading sources. And even though the students did better on the actual test than they've done previously, lots of them found reasons why they did better. And often the reasons why they did better had nothing to do with the strategy. Oh, it was an easier test, or that topic's easier than another topic. And so what we need to do is we need to convince them that the strategy works. And then the third element, so belief's not enough. And then we need to get to commitment. And the commitment that the effort required is worth it. Because that's the thing, is that students, to do this, they need to be committed to do this away from us prompting. And this is where we get into that sort of self-regulation in relation to motivation, persistence, metacognitive understanding, the Bjork's illusion of competence. All those factors come into play when we look at commitment. And the last one, and this sometimes people say that planning should come first or last, but what's the thing is that planning is the notion that we actually have to implement the plan, and we need to support students. And sometimes this overlaps with Duckworth's work. The Susser and McCabe work is really quite significant, is that it comes back to this planning is actually coming from the individual, that they know that they should be able to do these things and it works for them. And so what we're going to look at now is there's the Applying the Science of Learning, which is McDaniel's, Einstein, and N in 2012, actually applied the knowledge, beliefs, commitment process to an actual first year cognitive science subject at the George Washington University in St. Louis. And what we needed to understand was the notion of how obviously knowledge is easy because we've discussed that earlier, but when we looked at the belief, what they really focused on is the prompting for students to solidify and acknowledge the benefits in the strategy. And this is really hard because what we're actually asking the students to do is to actually acknowledge within themselves that this new strategy, which could be a challenge or could be different. And remember, if we go back to the Bjork's work, if something is new, something is always going to be termed more difficult. So that we're always coming over the barrier that something is new, it's difficult. Because it's difficult, it's going to take effort. But what's really interesting, and this comes out in Tom Perry's work as well, is that desirable difficulties. The Bjorks talk about desirable difficulties all the time. And that means that there needs to be effort. And so what we're saying here, and what Mark is saying in relation to the belief, is that students need to actually understand, for them to develop belief, they actually have to have a richer understanding of the mechanisms involved in the learning process. So that's building on the knowledge, but putting it into practice. Then when we look at demonstration, so he talks a lot about demonstration. And what he's looking at here is he's looking at the demonstration of the individual student. And I'll just give you some time to read through these particular demonstrations. And this is the individual student account. And this is why I guess the translation, which is what this event's all about, is the focus, is because we can easily work out what strategies are high utility or moderate utility or low utility. But the key thing is that how do we actually get students to actually take what we're teaching them and put it into their own practice? And the thing is, often the conversations are actually at the individual student layer. And what we're seeing here is that often the students in the demonstration process, you're actually rejigging and retraining their sort of trajectory. And one of the elements that they do in this particular course was the commitment, where students were required to apply a strategy to at least one other course. So this was an assignment. So students got credit by actually applying and translating it to another subject area. And what was interesting is that we found as well is that if we can get strategy instruction embedded into an actual content relevant subject or course or assignment, we're starting to see the utility value exercise actually increasing. What we're saying is we can't just create these novel scenarios that sit on the side of the curriculum. What we're actually looking at is actually how do you integrate within the immediate subject context to then drive that commitment. And then we finish off with planning. And the last element of the example that Mark's got for us here is that the students within their subject actually had to generate a plan and how they would apply the strategy. And after planning, what the students had to do was reflect. And I guess this is that sort of reflective cycle that a lot of us would apply. And here are some examples. So the subject at Washington University in St. Louis is called Cognitive Neuroscience 101, or the first year subject. And what you can see here is that this is a student's plan, their study plan that they've submitted. And what we can see here is that in essence, you look at the timings. What's really interesting is the students have the opportunity to arrive at their own time. They're really nice, tight segments of time, which I guess are doable. And then overall, what was interesting is we spend a lot of time, and this is sort of what Tom said before in terms of those graphic organizers that the teachers are doing. It's all about how we stick to the graphic designer or the graphic plan. And what was interesting here is that students have plans, but they don't stick to the plan. And that's another challenge that we have. And so here's some results from their survey. This is an example of the survey that he has in relation to pre-post. And what was interesting was that he broke the strategies down into what he called non-generative or passive. And I guess there's a lot out there about passive learning and what is passive learning and passive engagement. But what we can see here is pre-course versus post-course. And again, we see this notion of rereading of notes being this massive draw to students. And I guess there's this, we see it within our own students that they believe that they're doing something. But the issue is that they're doing nothing because there's no effort when it comes to rereading their notes. They're actually not doing anything. When we look at the generative activity, what's interesting here is what the students are actually moving towards. Flashcards was a big thing. Drawing was another. And another thing that he looked at was the notion of quizzing, mnemonics, teaching other people, self-explanation, and so forth. And I guess at the end of the day, what he did was he looked at the next stage, where he looked at the end of the course and then 7 months after. And I guess what he's looking at here is the solidification in using some of those sort of higher utility strategies. And when we look at the qualitative feedback, I guess this is the challenge that we all have, is that we have a class of 20, 25, 28, 29, 30, whatever, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But the issue is that each individual is different. And often and the reason why most programs, according to Mark's notes, focus on the knowledge is because the knowledge is the easiest thing to impart. I, as the teacher at the front, can impart the knowledge to everyone. And I make the assumption that they're all listening to me and that they're all taking it on board. They're synthesizing it with what they currently have, and they're changing. Now, some students, that will work for them. And we know of those. We could, if we all went around the 128 people who are in this session, they could all identify those students who are ready to adopt any strategy or any new technique that we give. But at the same time, we could also identify those students who are incredibly resistant. And I guess the thing is that it's an individual's progression. And that's the challenge that we all have, is that the translation of the cognitive science to really work is the idea that they need to uptake it. And this was an example that we gave Mark from our own sort of context. And we're going to refer to this student as Bob. Now, his name is not Bob, but this student is a good example. Now, this student was involved in the pilot class, and he's currently in year 12. And he's an interesting lad. He's one of those people who stands out from the crowd a little bit in a very galvanizing way. But what's really interesting is the student, when he came in year 7, 8, was below average, was about average. So his GPA matched the cohort's average to basically 1 decimal place. But also his learning behaviors were below average as well. And he was not, sometimes he got, detentions, and he was a likable character, but, he graced the detention room from time to time. Now, over a period of time, we started with him in year 9, and over a period of iteration. Now, it didn't happen overnight for this student. This student didn't start to actually improve over time. But what was really interesting is now this student is sitting at an A+ GPA in year 12 at the moment, in teaching in subjects of both math methods, specialist maths, two of the sciences, and so forth. And what's interesting, he's gone from one of the best students in the cohort, but his change was iterative over time. He gradually improved, he gradually changed, and now he has a plan. And what's really interesting, his voice has actually come back and actually helped us understand, well, how do you actually go after those students who are very resistant because they have such strong belief that what's working for them is there. So we'll finish with some questions. Sorry, I've just been rattled through that presentation, but I'll stop sharing now, and we'll open the floor for some questions. Richard?
Well, thanks so much, Terry. And one of the things that struck me just as we're waiting for some questions to come through was this idea that failure is actually one of the really important things in the learning journey, acting as, I guess, as a catalyst to change, a catalyst to reevaluating some of the habits that may not have been very good habits around study. And so we've seen a little bit of that here, but do you want to just expand on that idea just briefly?
Sorry, can you say that again? I was reading the chat. I can't split my attention. My cognitive load I'm at cognitive load. I've got split attention. So sorry, can you say that again?
We may all be reaching cognitive load limitations soon. So the break is coming up, I think. But just the benefits of failure, really, to recalibrate and to act as, I guess, something of a catalyst, those experiences of failure acting as a catalyst for students to look a little bit more critically at their habits of learning, which might not always be overly positive.
So I guess the best source of work, and again, I go back to Robert and Elizabeth Bjork's work, and I'd highly recommend anyone read it, because they've got there's two massive seminal, well, they've been super powerful in the field of cognitive science for some time. But there's two elements that work together. And the first one is desirable difficulties. So what we've got is we've got a context where we've got students who, for the retrieval practice to really work, there has to be effort. The issue is that if there's no effort, then there's no learning. But the effort for some students, they perceive it as, oh, this is hard, I must be doing something wrong. And then they remove themselves. And I use the analogy of going to the gym. So what we often find is if students want to build big muscles, because remember our brain and our biceps are the same type of muscle, they only get better through hard work. Now, if I go and lift a 100-kilo weight, I only have to do it for a short period of time, but I will get some benefit because there's effort. I'm exercising, I'm putting in the effort. The effort's causing my muscles to get bigger. But if I go and get the 500-gram weight and sit there for hours on end, and I guess what the Bjorks talk about is that students see effort as attributed to failure or that they're doing it wrong. And what's happening there is that they tap out and they are likely to then, oh, that's why rereading is such a default strategy, because you can't fail to reread. Like rereading, there's no failure in rereading. It's easy. I can just pick up these set of notes and I can start reading and yeah, I feel like I'm doing something. But in essence, what we need to understand is that there's also this, what they call metacognitive illusion of competence. What we see with students is, that's the other part that the Bjorks talk about, is that if students see something as easy, that means they're doing well, which means it's working for them, and therefore good stuff leads to good things. But if I'm struggling and therefore I have a lower view of myself, my competence is lower, failure is a bad thing. And if students take that view that failure is a bad thing, then they'll actually never get really better. Because as we all know as teachers, we talk about fail fast or fail easy. And the other element that we need to look at is, how do we allow failure for growth? How do we allow that failure to actually prompt the individual to actually look at, well, what led to the failure, diagnose what's the cause, and then rectify. But what we do find with students who have what the Bjorks talk about, metacognitive illusion of competence, if everything's easy, then they've never failed, everything's good. But often we find with those students is, at the end of the day, they're not actually, their failure comes later on down the road. And if we go back to that original slide earlier on about the older the student is, the more resistant they are to change, is because for a lot of people, they've developed that notion of, these are my marks, my success is intrinsically derived to myself, and therefore my identity is there, my marks are there, my identity and marks become the same thing. And over time, they become this sort of self-perpetuating cycle. Now, then when someone fails, there's disaster. Often, the older the student is, failure often means some sort of economic output in relation to, that means I can't go on to the next semester 2 in first year university.
Terry, thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions online, but I think they're mostly responded to, and we do have our keynote number 3 coming up